joining us for this session on ports and airports. Obviously a matter of great import, although everything is coloured, as we know, by the pandemic and the extent to which people are going to return to forms of transport. I'm slightly on the pessimistic wing of this, but I hope that other people are full of optimism and will tell us that things will get back to normal. We'll be all strap hanging on trains, and all the planes will be full and flying to all the places that they used to fly to. This is obviously a very important aspect for the North, and we're going to start. We've got a great lineup of speakers. We're going to start with Tom Thackray from the CBI. Over to you, Tom.
Well, thanks very much. And I'm Tom. I'm the Director for Infrastructure and Energy Policy at the CBI, and we represent businesses, large, medium and small, right across the UK, both providers of infrastructures, operators of infrastructures, but obviously users of infrastructure as well. And in the case of airports and ports, obviously there have been real worries, particularly in the aviation sector, around their ability to trade their way back to recovery due to the ongoing impacts of the pandemic and government policy. But if you're looking longer term and we want to make the most of these international assets over the long term, we really need to focus on making them as connected as possible. And that means really great access to them through different transport modes right across the country, including the North. And particularly for the North, I think projects like HS2, the Transpennine upgrades, dualling the A1, these are things that really matter to ports and airports in particular. So, the provision of an HS2 station at Manchester airports, improvement to freight routes across the Pennines, so linking the Port of Liverpool to major manufacturing centres in Yorkshire, and the electrification of rail freight capacity from Immingham Port. Just a few projects in the northern domain, which I think are going to be fundamental for competitiveness and international connectivity for businesses in the future. It's also important to note that there are projects elsewhere in the country which are going to be important for northern prosperity and connectivity as well. So things like completing the Lower Thames crossing is a really important freight route for goods travelling to the north of the country as well. And I would just say, in terms of delivering these projects, I think we talked a good game in terms of delivering infrastructure across the country in the past without a great record in delivery. And I think to up our performance in that kind of area, I think it's important that devolution occurs in a meaningful way. And that means budgets being devolved on a long-term basis, which gives certainty to the public sector, but also to private finance in crowding in their support for those kind of aspects of travel. The final point I'd make as just introduction is just around the green economy. And I think, we want to talk about green jobs, skills and growth in these sectors as well. And I think there is a massive opportunity there, but it's clear that we need to be investing from a position of strength. And that's why, investing and supporting the aviation sector, the port sector, over this difficult period as we're still recovering from the pandemic is going to be absolutely fundamental. But thanks a lot, Christian. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Tom. You've got a couple of minutes left, so can I just maybe ask what specifically? I know this is difficult, but what would you prioritise here, and what would you prioritise particularly for the North, or particularly for this sector? Where would you particularly in terms of ports and airports, is there something that's top of your agenda?
I think on the aviation side, I think it's difficult to look hugely beyond the impact of the pandemic at the moment in terms of just supporting that sector and making sure that we are encouraging a strong bounce back in demand when that's possible. I think from a CBI perspective, we understand the need to control the virus and to make the best of the progress that we've seen in the vaccination deployment. But I think it's clear that the sort of restrictions that we've got in the various levels of the traffic light system are really difficult for businesses to work with. I think green list countries by definition are those that pose very, very little risk in terms of the spread of variants of concern, because they have no variants of concern by definition. And And that being the case, we should be working towards removing the requirement for testing for those really low risk destinations in the future. And then going forward, it's really about making sure that we're embedding the right international standards, working with other countries through the G7, and having coordinated approach to things like vaccine passports. So I think for the aviation sector, that's really, really crucial. And then for ports and for connectivity more generally, I think it's around really, I think the green economy is going to be a huge asset to these areas. I think we're already seeing great prospects for investment in the northeast when it comes to offshore wind and the deployment of new technologies like carbon capture and storage and the hydrogen economy. But it's about how we make those projects investable. I think it's about providing a route to market, particularly for carbon capture and storage and hydrogen, through the deployment of things like contract for difference or future.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. That brings us nicely on to Lynn Collins from the TUC, who's going to, I think, focus on looking at green aspects and Green New Deal and whatever. Lynn, over to you. Do unmute. Oh, well done. You've unmuted yourself. Over to you, Lynn.
Thanks, Christian. So just a few words of introduction about the TUC itself. So we represent 5.6 million workers across 48 different trade unions. So for aviation and ports, you'll probably know the big general unions that organise in that sector, Unite, GMB. But we also have a range of very specialist unions who organise in the sector, and we bring them together in our transport fora. So examples would be the United Road Transport Union, Nautilus International, who organise seafarers, and the Association of Flight Attendants and the British Airline Pilots Association. So lots of TUC members absolutely affected by the changes that have taken place to transport and particularly aviation over the last year. So before kind of considering the future for aviation and ports, I suppose we need to kind of do what Tom did and look at where things stand at present. There's 1.2 million jobs in the sector, and demand for that sector fell by 98% at the start of the pandemic. So 2% of its usual levels. The sector is absolutely at the moment heavily reliant on the furlough scheme and on business support initiatives for companies within the sector. So the first priority, I think, before we think about how we build better in the future, is to think about how we protect the sector, because by their very nature, jobs in this sector aren't easy to switch on and switch off. There's long lead-in times for getting systems back up and running. There's mechanical issues that will have to be dealt with fleets. There's retraining and health and safety briefing for staff and cabin crew. So it's a real problem if we haven't got that kind of lead-in to knowing when the sector's coming back online, and having the unfurloughing, as I call it, of furlough on the horizon from July onwards, where employers are going to have to start paying increasing amounts for massive impact on the sector. So the TUC's brought together all the unions in the sector, prepared a joint statement, and made a number of calls on the Treasury and on the Department of Transport. So just to kind of summarise the kind of issues that the TUC have raised, they've called on the Treasury to combine furlough support and business support so that the tapering of both of those things happen as the sector reopens, so there isn't an adverse impact or a cliff edge that people can fall off, and giving people time to do that, retaining capacity and rebuilding the capability in the sector. Also calling on the Department of Transport to try to rebuild the sector in the cleanest and greenest possible way. Use the pause as an opportunity to think about how the sector tackles its climate responsibilities. So commitment to invest in technology to reduce the carbon footprint of the aviation industry. And I'd also mention that we obviously have a considerable number of jobs in the aviation construction industry here in the north, and particularly in the northwest, organisations like British Aerospace and Rolls-Royce. So that kind of cleaning and greening of the sector can start with construction in the sector. those organisations have a good track record of adapting skills, bringing in apprenticeships, working with local schools to keep the pipeline of local employment over, and good partnership arrangements with their trade unions to be able to adapt and pivot the sector. So we've got a real opportunity, I think, in the north, and particularly in the northwest, to do that. We're also calling on the Jet Zero Council nationally to fully engage and involve unions and workers in the sector. A lot of the solutions about better green jobs come from the workers within the sector. And more generally, I think we're calling on everybody involved in the rebuilding of the sector to adopt a partnership approach with government, employers and trade unions working together. So if I could just finish by maybe making a couple of comments about maritime ports and free ports. One particular aspect of maritime is the cruise industry. I'm sitting here looking out on the River Mersey, and yesterday the first cruise ship docked for about 18 months in Liverpool. And cruise maritime has a massive impact on economies here in the northwest, because we do have cruise ships docking. We have a visitor economy based on that. But interestingly, we have other sectors of employment. This week we had a session with our cultural and creative industries. Many of the first jobs into culture and creative jobs were on cruise ships, and we've had 2 years of all of those opportunities taken away from young people going into those industries. So the sector has a massive impact on other aspects of work as well. Finally, just to touch on Freeports, we've been working in Liverpool City region to make sure that the Freeport bid is built on principles of good jobs and fair employment. Metro Mayor Steve Rotherham, who I know spoke earlier, has a fair employment charter, and we're keen to make sure that that charter doesn't stop at the gate of the Freeport, and that the development of Freeport initiatives is based on the idea of good jobs, secure jobs, and access into work for the local communities those Freeports serve. And that needs to be built on the strong principles of social partnership that I talked about. This is a real opportunity for solution making as a collective responsibility with us all around the table. So yeah, I think they're the points I want to make in opening, and happy to chip in as things go along. Thanks, Christian.
Okay, can I just push you on one point? I mean, what do you think the most important thing getting out of the crisis caused by the pandemic is? What's the kind of one? You know, I heard you say about the defurloughing, a new word in the English language, but what do you think is the absolute must kind of that will bring about a recovery the quickest?
I think it's avoiding that cliff edge where we see people drop out of the industry, and then when the industry starts to open up again, we haven't got the pipeline of qualified staff to open the industry. So it is a combination of that support with the furlough scheme and the business support matching across to, as Tom was talking about, green and amber countries, the expansion of leisure travel. So if we get that wrong, we'll lose people from the sector, and there'll be massive costs to employers to rehire and retrain people going into the sector. So it needs a real partnership approach, and it needs all those strings drawing in and working together.
Okay, well, hopefully this conference is working towards it. Right, David, you've got a little bit of a challenge there, I think, from Lynn, in that she said, Freeports must be, create good jobs and fair employment, and there mustn't be a kind of frontier between the Freeport. So, David, can you take us through your presentation? David Leighton, sorry, this is of Front Street Consulting, who's going to talk on Freeports and the like.
Thank you very much, Christian. I was asked to talk about the future of Freeports, and actually specifically their importance for the economy. I will open simply by observing that I think a lot of the discussion about the pros and cons of Freeports has been to an extent contaminated by pre and post-Brexit politics. I don't think that the concerns about free ports being becoming havens for crime or reduced lower environmental standards or even workers' standards are actually well grounded, let's say. And I completely agree with Lynn, and I'm sure it will be the case that workers' rights will be enhanced as they are in other parts of the economy, enhanced and protected. Having made that observation, I would say that one way to think about the government's free ports policy is in fact simply as another package of measures by government to encourage economic development, continuing a long tradition of such interventions by governing parties of all colours. In fact, I think we can look at free ports as super enterprise zones. So the question then is, will their impact be super? And on that question, Christian, I think it's probably too early to say. I suspect that the final policy is in practice relatively modest. Whilst a multi-site approach was always sensible, I think the arbitrary 45-kilometre limit around Freeports was perhaps rather too narrow and unnecessary. I think this might reflect unfounded anxiety about security on the part of HMRC, as well as a familiar concern in Treasury about so-called additionality and displacement risk. We talk about creating economic clusters in the UK and place-based economic development, but I think sometimes our definition of place is too small. To be globally competitive over the longer term, we need to think bigger, beyond single boroughs, cities, or indeed regions. I expect some may disagree, but perhaps one day a northern powerhouse Freeport might be something to look at. Some economists argue that a narrow geographic scope is needed to achieve so-called agglomeration benefits, but I think we can now see how these can be achieved virtually over much larger areas. So in short, I think we might have missed an opportunity by not allowing free ports to be much larger in scope and scale. I also sense actually that the Treasury should have allowed more successful Freeport bids in the round that we had earlier this year. I think some of the bids that did fail were still very, very strong. That said, I think from the North's perspective, the region or the area is bound to be a significant beneficiary of the free ports that have been awarded. So Teesside, Humber and Liverpool City region, as was previously mentioned. I sincerely hope that the package of incentives available to those free ports does tip the balance in attracting new investment. For instance, a new Tesla factory in Teesside. I'm also especially hopeful, actually, that they make a useful contribution to attracting investment in manufacturing. I do think it's important in a post-COVID world that we focus more on expanding the UK's manufacturing base and addressing our chronic current account deficit. I'm also optimistic about free ports in the sense that I believe they're much better placed to attract additional government spending and investment over time, including in terms of connectivity. I think actually for this reason alone, putting the detail of the policy itself to one side, I think it's one reason why the ports that are free ports have a great opportunity. I think that the label itself is hugely significant. In other words, even if you believe the policy will not be successful for whatever reason, I think you can rely on the fact that government will endeavour to make those free ports a success, even if it means using levers outside the free port policy framework itself. They're my observations, Christian.
Can I just get you to sketch out a little bit about this? I mean, I used to write about development corporations kind of 30 years ago, 30, maybe even more. I wrote about the Docklands one in London in the 80s. And yes, there has been successes of that, but also some terrible failures as well. And so, what are the key things that, I mean, what's a key aspect of a Freeport that will ensure its success? What's the main USP of a Freeport?
Well, in the UK, there's two aspects. Freeports will have custom zones where businesses essentially can import goods, ideally, for instance, for manufacturing purposes, without having to pay duty on those goods. The other aspect is described as tax zones, and there's a whole host of different measures that businesses can benefit from if they are located within these so-called tax zones. There's a comprehensive suite of different benefits that the government has offered, including things like business rate relief, relief on national insurance contributions, enhanced capital allowances, enhanced building and structures allowance, stamp duty, land tax relief. So there's a lot of stuff in there. But the sort of question you describe, Christian, is one of those things that it's a never-ending debate about what government should do to try and win your investment and what incentives it needs to put in place, particularly in certain areas. There are always successes and failures. I think in the context of Freeports, I think the important thing is it can't have a disadvantageous effect. It does position these areas, or makes these areas better positioned to attract investment. And as I said earlier, actually, to attract investment even from government in terms of connectivity. So I think we just have to wait and see. Actually, I don't think anybody could possibly make any conclusive observations at the moment.
Okay, there's some questions coming on the chat about Freeports, but I want to just move on, and then we'll come back to you in the panel session, because I somewhat suspect that Freeports are going to be a big topic of discussions, just as development corporations were 30 years ago. Our final speaker in this session is Richard Gutsell from Atkins, who's responsible for ports and borders, and I think he's going to talk about the Green Deal, but over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Christian. Yes, the question I've been set is, will green recovery provide for a reset opportunity for port sector to build back better and greener in the north, and what are the challenges to that? Which is a very big question. I think we've seen from my colleagues that the ports sector has suffered massively, with passenger numbers falling off a cliff and maritime cargo subject to huge variations from Brexit, from COVID. It's become very lumpy, very unpredictable in its passage. And what this has meant for the industry is that investment money is really, really scarce. So the question, apart from anything, is how do we build back, let alone build back green? But in considering that green question, we have to look at our targets. And really, to me, it becomes an obligation. Even as far as 2050 for net zero is massively challenging. If we look at the sector, the refresh rate for technology and infrastructure is measured in decades, not years. So the ships we launch in the next few years and the planes we fly will probably be flying in 2050. And if we don't launch green ships and green planes, we're not hitting the 2050 target. So that's a massive challenge. So I'm going to talk about three things that I think are critical to being able to meet that challenge. And that's digital and data, innovation and clustering. So the first of those on digital and data, really in rebuilding the sector, we've got to put digital and data at its heart. We've got to use digital tools to understand our assets and understand the environment. And in particular, I'm talking about exploiting the growing movement, the growing technology around digital twins, because these can help us deliver green port growth. Now, when you have tools like these in the digital world, you can design in efficiency. You can design in green and greener materials. And critically, you can experiment in those digital environments before you create waste in the real environment. It's a great place to test green tech before you deploy it. And when you do deploy it, once you create a living digital environment, you can understand what it's doing, you can understand the feedbacks, and you can tweak it and optimize it. And in that environment, we can understand the environmental impact of our initiatives, like Freeports, and we can plan the mitigation for those before, again, we try and do things in the real world. And I really think Freeports that David talked about are an opportunity to enter the digital twin world, collate the assets that are going into them from local authorities, port companies, landowners, and start that digital twin journey to optimize their development. The other advantage is you then build in resilience as well. And we've seen that across the north, but across the country, that the resilience of our ports wasn't there nationally, particularly in the cargo piece. Now, once you're in operation, your Freeport or your port, the digital tool is fantastic to optimize its operation and drive in efficiency and drive out pollution, which is caused by the inefficiency. There's a fantastic example that the Highways Agency and Network Rail are working on, associated with port connectivity, and they're looking at the transition of cargo from HGVs on the road to rail, and they're building a data model around this. And it seems easy on the face of it because it's more efficient to put it on rail, but actually taking 35 lorries off the road and putting them on a train and corralling those lorries and transferring them to the train, or getting them onto the train and off the train, it's these last links that are critical. So understanding the interactions of the different types of cargo, the data, the last links is really critical. And they're doing some really exciting stuff to show how you release these improvements and take carbon out of the atmosphere. The other digital piece, which I think we've really got to get right, is the digital operation of our borders in our ports. At the moment, borders mean delays. And anyone in that 2% who are still traveling by air probably knows that better than most. But we have the opportunity through deploying digital technologies that are really here now to achieve straight through processing at our borders. When you start your processes earlier in the digital world, when you pre-clear cargo, pre-clear people, you can massively reduce those delays. And delays equal inefficiency, and that equals pollution. So I was pleased to see both earlier this week and I think last week, the Home Office talking about their strategy and talking about moving more to the digital. But we really need to get that right and deliver the technology, deliver the innovation in that space. Which leads me on to the innovation piece. As I said, the legacy in our sector is a huge issue. The refresh rate, be it in the hard infrastructure, runways, deep sea ports, etc., or the ships and the aeroplanes that we move things around by. We need to massively accelerate green innovation, and that's going to require investment. There are some good things in place now that we need to take advantage of and build on. In particular, the catapults, the various catapults that operate across the country, the digital catapult and the smart places catapult. And actually in the north, there's some fantastic initiatives I think Tom mentioned, but hydrogen in Teesside, wind power in the Humber. And these should become hubs and clusters for innovation. The more you encourage SMEs and businesses to cluster, the more you can accelerate that innovation. So we need clear strategies to make that happen. In these clusters, I think we need to create the test beds. Really safe environments where businesses can experiment safely. It should not be unsafe, but it should be licensed to experiment and make the great leaps forward in technology that we need. Because in the green space, we don't have the answers to these. You know, we're starting to see more green cars on the road, but we're a long way from the cargo sector, from ships and maritime moving to green energy. There's a great example actually Atkins are involved in, where we're working with a consortium. We are trialing green flights, EV tolls, electronic vertical takeoff and landing air taxis between the city centre and the airport. And it's moving really quickly. The intention is to have these vehicles in commercial flights in 2, 3, 4 years. And this plan is to show how this can be done and look at the systems of systems that controls and makes these kind of flights safe. But that kind of experiment is really critical, and we need to do more of it and faster. Now, I think one of the key levers to doing more and faster is collaboration. And Lynn spoke about collaboration across different organizations. I don't think we collaborate very well at the moment, particularly on green issues. Ports are really set up to compete. I deal with lots of different ports, and even within port groups who are owned by the same company, they're competing against each other. And that doesn't foster collaboration, it doesn't foster innovation, it doesn't foster the sharing of ideas, which is really key to the green agenda. Now, we need regional collaboration, but we also need vertical collaboration. We need clear strategies for green, and that means local government, that means education, businesses and charities and society, wider society, and of course the TUC and unions, to create these integrated strategies, because everything is linked to everything else. And I was pleased, Lynn, you were speaking about the skills agenda apart from anything else. So for innovation, of course, we need PhDs and higher education institutions. Often innovation is spun out of them, but actually it
Richard,
goes right.
I don't want to stop you mid-flow, but you're slightly overrunning your
Am
time.
I over? I'm nearly there. Sorry.
Right, okay.
The skills agenda is really key, but it goes right down the ladder. Critically, Freeports is entry as well, the level 1, level 2 skills, to provide the skills that are going to enable innovators to scale. And Christian, that was it. That was my conclusion. I think there's a real opportunity. These 3 levers are absolutely key. And of course, it's an obligation. We've got to use this opportunity, however hard it is, to deliver these and other levers to really drive the green agenda. Thanks, everyone. Sorry I overran.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I mean, I must say, as a transport person, I'm rather skeptical of planes flying into the middle of towns and taking rather well-off people out of them. But we won't go there. We can discuss. If we were not virtual, we'd discuss it in the coffee break. Let me just. There was one interesting point I want to push you on before I open it up with some of the questions that are coming through, which is. You said a rather interesting idea about clustering. Are you suggesting, I'm melding 2 ideas here, but are you suggesting that a particular Freeport should specialize in particular kind of aspects of whatever, to a particular industry or particular type of development or whatever?
Yes, and I believe that is part of the Freeport strategy, and that's what the Freeports should have put aspects of that in their bids. So particular green technology, and I think that requires cross-government coordination. We don't need 8 Freeports specialising in wind power. We need a distribution of those. So to my knowledge, we've got hydrogen in Teesside. We've got more than 1 Freeport in wind power. The future of nuclear is potentially a big part of the Freeport agenda as well. So you need to create some specialisms within those Freeports, and that is an accelerator on development and occupation and creation of the jobs.
Okay, first of all, there's a question to all of you, which I'll do, and then there's some questions on Freeports. The question from Laurie Quinn is, given Brexit and the aspirations for global Britain, what do the panelists think a UK approach to spatial planning will make to ensure trade and movement of people is sustained in a build it back better Britain, particularly with relation to ports and aviation? Obviously there's a lot of discussion about spatial planning. There's a legislation kind of promised. So I'll just take it in the order that you spoke at. So Tom.
I think my main comment on that would be that we know how important international connectivity is to trading performance. So you can see in the figures that once a new aviation link to a fast-growing market has an immediate impact on local economic growth, and you've seen some of the key flights from Newcastle Airport to the Middle East, for example, as really good examples of that. So I think in terms of a spatial planning approach, you want to be facilitating the ease of access for businesses to those key links to international destinations. And I think that sort of goes back to some of the infrastructure investment priorities that I spoke about at the start. It's, the ease with which you enable that travel will make it a much more enticing prospect for businesses and much an easier thing to do. And I think the figures really back up how important that will be. And as we sort of look beyond Brexit and look to expand the list of trading partners we're working with, I think it's about the government supporting that through all of its policies, including planning.
Again, I mean, things are slightly unclear about regional airports policy. I mean, are you saying that there ought to be a greater stress on greater support for regional airports. I mean, that is a crucial thing.
I think some of these key trading destinations needs to be part of our international trade strategy, and the importance of international connectivity needs to be properly understood. I think sometimes, I would hate for there to be a knee-jerk reaction because of the pandemic to international connectivity, which thinks that it's not going to be prioritized by business. There's so many aspects of international business that needs to continue to be done face to face. The specialist skills for maintenance of machinery, for example. These are things that businesses rely upon, and that's why it needs to be at the center of the strategy.
Okay, Lynn, spatial planning.
Oh, not my area of expertise, but let me think about some of the issues that our unions raise with us as problems that need solutions as part of the rebuilding of the sector. So we know from our public and commercial union that border control is a big issue, and resources to be available at the borders to make sure that we streamline the processes for getting people in and out of the country as we open up borders again. We know from cultural and creative unions that travel for work, so the ability to travel as part of a performance group or whatever around Europe has been a massive problem, and not just because of COVID, because of the restrictions around Brexit as well. And we know there's massive shortages, skill shortages in some jobs because people aren't travelling into the country for work as they were before. So retail, hospitality, a couple of the sectors, but also starting to show now in health and social care, in some of the entry-level jobs in health and social care. And then there are issues around obviously farming as well, which we'll find during harvest this summer. So there's a massive lot of problems that are a kind of conglomeration really of Brexit, which didn't really unfold before COVID hit, and we're not clear what's going to come out the other side of it. I think there's a real testing time for things like border control just at the moment. If they get it right while we've got low levels of traffic, then we may be able to open up borders safely and quickly with the right resources and the right support for staff to do that. But a whole set of problems. So I hope that kind of touches slightly on it without...
it does, but I was slightly depressing picture you're painting there, but I do understand it. I mean, are there things that you think are specific to while you're in the Northwest, but the North generally, that in terms of spatial planning or in terms of other things that the government should be focusing on in particular to help this region?
Well, there's kind of wider transport connectivity issues. The purpose of transport is to connect people with work.
Yeah, but HS2 is 15 years away. It's not. Although, I mean, there was the TransPennine announcement yesterday, but again, it's probably it's not going to help you in the short term over pandemic, is it?
And I don't think there's many workers who are looking at HS2 as being the solution to the problems. Quite a lot of workers are looking at Knowsley Industrial Estate and realising you can't get a bus there because all the buses don't match the shifts in the manufacturing plants there. So it's that kind of really hyper-local transport that I think is a big issue, and that will affect getting people to where jobs are. If jobs remain on high streets for retail, for hospitality, then we need to get people to those. But if jobs move away from high streets into more local communities, we need to make sure that we've got that kind of local transport infrastructure that can actually get people to where they need to be to work.
That's such a good point, actually, and one that should be driven home, and that I write about quite a lot. That it's all very well talking about the big projects and whatever, but actually sometimes it's the boring old buses that you just need. Fair to the government, they do seem to be kind of having a more sensible bus policy, but it's too early to see it in practice. David, spatial planning. I mean. Freeports are obviously kind of a key aspect of this.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I will do the old classic echoing of comments earlier, in particular Tom's. However, I think Brexit, no Brexit, whatever. We've always been a trading nation, always, and the entire foundation of our economy, our future prosperity, is based on connectivity, basically connectivity to markets globally, internationally, and therefore I think we should always see that, regard connectivity in the context of spatial planning as something of paramount importance. You're on mute, Christian. I'm privileged to say that you're on mute, Christian.
And I did a swear word there, but you won't have heard it because I was
That's
on
the first time it's been the other way around. It's usually me.
Sorry, I was just. Can I just press you on that, because you can't have a new spatial planning policy without. I mean, if you've got this Freeport aspect, somehow you have to meld in the two, and you have to say, what is your spatial planning policy trying to do, or vice versa? What impact does your Freeport policy have on spatial planning? Because there are some concerns, and there's a question later on that reflects this concern, that having some Freeports kind of just nabs a lot of jobs off somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, the Treasury government, as I mentioned earlier, are very mindful of this sort of displacement risk, and there's a focus on making sure that the jobs that are attracted to Freeports are in fact, a net addition to employment in the UK, and perhaps something like a Tesla factory on Teesside would be a classic example of that. That's a factory going to the UK that perhaps could have gone elsewhere. We don't know what the outcome of that is, of course, at the moment, but fingers crossed. I'll just add one other point, which is actually in the context of spatial planning. In fact, all areas of policy, I actually think personally, they do need to sit beneath and be guided by a long-term economic strategy. And I know that the CBI is doing work around this. They've got their Seize the Moment document. I think that actually the question for the North, the question for the UK, I think to get things right in the long term, we do need that kind of guiding strategy that sits above everything. Spatial planning, transport, the whole lot. What sort of economy do you want to be, and how are we going to achieve it? And then CBI's make a very important step forward in that discussion, that debate. But I'd like to see something actually executed and formalised by government in that sense.
Yes, I mean, it's not something that Conservative governments have generally been very strong on. They don't really see the advantage of having this kind of overriding strategy. Maybe I could just come back to Tom just briefly before I go to Richard on that point. I mean, can you see a coherent, integrated national policy coming out with a spatial planning as part of it, and then all sorts of other details which would include Freeports coming into it? I mean, is that something that that is feasible?
Yeah, I think on spatial planning, I guess I would sort of question the extent to which that should be nationally driven, or whether that should just be local economies really sort of defining what's going to be their calling card and channeling their own investment and attracting private investment to support those objectives. I think if you look in the years after 2010, if you look at the where local authorities had to make reductions in their budgets, it was local economic development and planning that took the highest proportion of cuts to that stage, and they haven't been built up yet. So you've seen capability been diminished over that time. We need to build that back up to make good on the promise that we have for local economies. I think it's good of David's to highlight the CBI's work this week on Seize the Moment. I think we are very conscious in the years after the financial crisis. It's been characterized by political debates around Brexit, around unequal growth, failure to take opportunities. And if we come out of the pandemic and fail to take the opportunities of the green economy, of levelling up agenda, then it's going to be a real tragedy for the UK economy, and we can't afford to miss that moment. So we've got a moment in time at the moment where businesses have to step forward and collaborate with governments to on a new and optimistic agenda to 2030. we do need the government to sort of show some leadership and to work in partnership. But I think, you know, a lot of these opportunities can be grasped independently by businesses, working with their staff, working with other parts of society, and working with local economies, independently of what the national government strategy is, because obviously that is subject to change over the years.
I might take with that you're slightly sceptical of the idea of having an overriding national policy. I mean, what about a regional policy, or even for a big area like encompassing both the northeast and the northwest together? I mean, do you see that as kind of preferable, kind of a series of regional overriding policies?
Yeah, no, don't get me wrong. I do think that it's great to have a plan, and it's great for local areas to set out and large geographies to do that. But I just don't think it should stop businesses from taking action in the absence of those plans. Because I think there are things that we can get after together, and particularly collaborating across sectors to take some of those opportunities.
Okay, Richard, spatial planning and its importance.
Thanks, Christian. First, I'm going to plug a report that Atkins collaborated on called A Spatial Plan for the North. A fantastic document, fantastic piece of work, very detailed. For me, there's an opportunity here. The question was around Brexit and our trade aspirations. We have to link our trade aspirations to our industrial strategy and our spatial plan. So our aspiration is to export green technologies around the world. And there's a real opportunity for the UK in that. We've seen how we've got leadership in technology and innovation in the past. Often we lose the manufacturing element of that, the scale of that. So we've got to create the spaces and the environments to enable us to capture that. I think that's partly about Freeports, but it's about skills I talked about. It's about spaces to build factories and big factories like the Tesla factory. And then the housing and connectivity, all that spatial plan coming together to deliver all of the support infrastructure for those products that we want to export overseas in this Brexit world.
Okay. I must say a lot of the questions are on Freeports, I'm afraid, David. Yes, Gordon Rose has picked up my point about London Docklands, and indeed, so again, as I mentioned, I wrote about it a lot. And of course, at one point, London Docklands virtually went bust. Also, certainly Olympia in New York went bust. And it had to be reincarnated, and it's gone through several phases. It was originally kind of low-rise warehouses, and it eventually became what it is today. So how long is it before we can get a settled Freeports policy and then see actually some benefits from this?
Thank you, Christian. Look, if for instance, if Elon Musk pops over tomorrow and announces the opening of a Tesla factory in the Freeport, be in Teesside or anywhere else, then there's instant empirical evidence there it's a resounding success, right? Can
I say that, having written a lot about Elon Musk, I don't trust a word he says.
I'm sure that's right, Christian. Don't forget to mention whichever book you did write about him in, and I'm sure we'll all go buy it.
I won't.
So the it's like any. I mean, the stuff about the Docklands, for instance, actually, certainly pre-pandemic, who knows how the future might look. I think the regeneration of that area, the development corporation, everything that's happened around there is definitely been a success. Sometimes in some of these initiatives, you have to be prepared to be patient. I think often in any of these special economic zones or any other measures that government might take, you don't have an instant silver bullet that works overnight. You've got to be prepared to basically stick with something for the long term. And I think that's probably one of the most important points. You might see some areas of development land which still have not been developed in 2 or 3 years' time. Does it mean that the policy is the wrong one or has failed? No. You just got to stick. You've got to stick with it. I am actually, to conclude on the most important point, is that I think I've got a vague recollection of seeing in a documentary, Christian, actually riding on a train around the Docklands, where you were probably talking about the issues that Gordon's just raised. Anyway.
Yes, no, I do take it, and you know, Docklands is 35, nearly 40 years old, and but it must be said that not all of it has turned out kind of that well. But we could debate that till the cows come home. I mean, which brings me actually onto another question, which is also, I'm afraid, to you, David, which is that you know, what about the concerns that there are about employment rights and existing legislation? So, I mean, you know, will these become kind of you know, under completely different rules than the rest of the country? And again, that begs the question of kind of sucking out jobs from elsewhere into these zones.
There is no part of the current policy that makes any provision for any dilution of employer rights, or you know, that steps outside the existing legislative frameworks that you find are currently applying to the United Kingdom, right? So people might, you know, they can speculate, but there's no evidence for it about government or others having an intention to try and do this sort of thing over time. But I actually think I just don't think there's any grounds for any concerns along those lines, be it in terms of employee rights, environmental standards, or anything else.
Okay, well, the proof will be in the pudding. What are we talking about in terms of timing here, though? I mean, you know, when's the soonest these might get up and running?
I think there's an ambition to have these up and running by the end of the year. End of the year, maybe drifting in some cases into 2022. We'll see. But yeah, the whole.
All of them, or just some of them?
Well, I think the ambition is, I mean, I'm not involved in all of the Freeports, but there's an ambition to have these things up and running as soon as possible. Sorry. Indeed, that's been a characteristic of the whole execution of the Freeport initiative, has been to deliver it at speed. So I think you'll find Freeports starting to open their doors by the end of the year.
Okay, David, I'll free you up and talk to Lynn wants to come in here, actually.
Yeah, I don't quite share David's optimism about Freeports not being a race to the bottom in terms of workers' rights. However, what I do think is really important is that we don't take it as a given, but it's baked into some of the Freeports that are being designed. So again, you know, we've worked with, I sit on the LEP board in Liverpool City region, and we've made sure that the principles of green jobs and good jobs are built into the Freeport bid from day one. I think alongside that, picking up some of the issues we talked about earlier around skills, I'd like to see really innovative partnerships being developed with local skills providers. You know, Richard made the point earlier, this isn't just about level 7, level 6, level 5 skills. This is about level 2 and level 3 skills, but working with local skills provider to get the jobs, to get people trained into the jobs that will be there in the future. So I think you can use a Freeport model as a focus of developing a range of collaborations and partnerships that really do improve the life chances of the people who live in the area around that Freeport. And in that way, hopefully you will avoid just a displacement of jobs into the Freeport. When new jobs are created, you'll have people there ready to take up those jobs. So it does give us an opportunity. I think it gives us an opportunity to break down stereotypes of routes into employment. You know, we can work with schools on work experience opportunities. There's a possibility of doing things right around what is just a kind of differently badged bit of government investment. And I hope that some of the bidders will take that up, and we're certainly keeping the pressure on in Liverpool City region to make sure it is a green jobs, good jobs Freeport that's established.
But so we can say that the TUC is broadly supportive of the concept.
Well, we've got lots of questions we want to ask, and if those questions are answered correctly, then happy to support. Yes, okay. That's the approach we take.
Tom, I think you wanted to come in.
Yeah, just a couple of points. Just on in terms of standards, be they sort of employment or environmental, I think that obviously there's a sort of government framework and a compliance issue for businesses that they need to be aware of, and obviously need to sort of meet the right standards. But increasingly, the requirement is obviously from their employees, but from their investors as well. And you look at the environmental movement at the moment, it is international finance which is voting to make the change in business. So businesses are absolutely going to have to prove that they're providing a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom if they wanted to secure that lower cost of capital in the future. So I'm pretty optimistic that, if a business wants to be a good business in the future, it's going to have to be uphold the highest standards in both of those areas. On the skills side of things, I think it's
sorry, can I just press you on that? You really think that there's been a step change in terms of business and environmental issues and green deals and all that? What has brought that about?
I think that the investor side, the customers and investors, and the movement of millennials and Generation Y into the workforce is just really having an impact in corporate boardrooms across the country right now. It's the top issue, I'd say, that is on business leaders' radar when we speak to them on a daily basis at the CBI. There's huge challenges around it, including how you make good on Scope 3 emissions, which is where the transport international movement of goods and people comes into it again. But yeah, I think it's absolutely the top issue beyond the pandemic for businesses in this country at the moment.
Okay, I'm just worried. I've seen this in transport, my field, but I'm just worried that people will say, the pandemic, sorry, we want to do the right thing, but it's all too difficult and blah blah blah. But your optimism kind of reassures me somewhat.
Yeah, I think so. It's tricky for businesses. It's for hard to abate sectors. If you're in in the steel sector or the cement business, then how the technology challenges are massively difficult. But yes, I am optimistic.
Okay, David, you wanted to come in, and I'll give Richard a last chance to talk as well. But after you, and
thank you very much,
David.
It was just quickly to add on to Tom's point. It is a real phenomenon whereby financial institutions are encouraging businesses to become greener, by offering lower, cheaper rates of finance. In fact, there was an announcement yesterday, which is why I was scrubbing around for my phone, by one of the UK's largest ports operators about how they've secured some new financing, I think, at a glance, which was based on achieving explicit environmental KPIs. So it's a very much a real phenomenon that we're talking about in this sense.
Okay, we'll leave the last word to Richard because we've got to all wind up. Just any last thoughts, Richard, before I have to wind up?
Christian, I was just going to make a link between Lynn and David's point on Freeports, and Lynn reminded me that the core purpose of Freeports is levelling up. Freeports are currently busy writing their business cases to get their hands on government funding, and that business case will not pass unless it delivers that core objective, levelling up. And that is what it's primarily about. And then the flow on from that is about global trade, innovation, everything else. But anyone that doesn't get that levelling up piece right shouldn't be allowed to become a Freeport.
A good note to end on. I'm amazed none of us had mentioned levelling up until now. Which is quite extraordinary. So thank you very much for all your contributions and the discussion. Now I have to say to everybody that there is a link on the chat to join for the final closing primary, where of course Andy Burnham, amongst others, will be talking, and you click on that link and get through. But thank you for all this. I think two things of interest that I thought were particularly of interest was the emphasis on green issues, which as I suggested is rather reassuring, and the interest in Freeports and the debate around Freeports, which I think will attract a lot of attention, and obviously has some potential to get it if they get it right, and there's some kind of negatives to get it wrong. So in particular, I think in regions like this, they could be a real boost, but not if they just displace jobs or kind of lower standards. So thank you, all of you, for contributing, and we can now move to the final session. So thank you very much.
Thank you.